You're listening to episode 112 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author Eric Weiner speaks with us about his book, Man Seeks God, My Flirtations with the Divine. In some way or other, we've all been seekers. Even if we've found that which satisfies us and fulfills us, getting there may have taken some experimentation. I suspect it's fairly uncommon for someone to be always satisfied from the moment of birth. This challenge of finding fulfillment is complicated when one is riding the edge of being a skeptic, but maintaining an openness to being spiritual. We may or may not mean spirituality in a supernatural sense. We may take it to be a perfectly natural way of living. But the endless choices remain. Do we join the local church because it's convenient, or because we deeply and truly believe in what's being said? Do we find our fulfillment comes from learning about science, or from joining a cult? Or do we simply donate our time at a homeless shelter? These questions are often background noise that we don't really face directly. Even as meditators, though we may be looking moment by moment at physicality, our responses to stimulus, our perceptions, our thoughts, we may not be looking too closely at the context in which we do that examination. Does this teacher or center have a hard line about rebirth? Do I? And sometimes it takes a specific event in our lives to prompt us to take that 10,000-foot view. Eric Weiner became the first full-time foreign correspondent for NPR in India in 1993. He spent 2 years based in New Delhi, covering everything from an outbreak of bubonic plague to India's economic reforms, before moving on to other postings in Jerusalem and Tokyo. Over the years, Eric reported from more than 30 countries, everywhere from Algeria to Indonesia. Those experiences led to his writing The Geography of Bliss, a New York Times bestseller that has been translated into 18 languages. In his latest book, Man Seeks God, Eric searched for a taste of the divine. He traveled to Kathmandu and Istanbul and even Vegas, where he experienced firsthand the varieties of religious experience. Eric's commentaries and essays appear in the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and the New Republic, among other publications. He writes regularly for a new travel magazine called Afar, and is former reporter for the New York Times. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Nepal Gran's estate. And our guest today is Eric Weiner, author of Man Seeks God, My Flirtations with the Divine. Eric, welcome to the Secular Buddhist. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ted. Happy to be here.
So I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a bit about your background and how that related to your ending up writing the book.
Well, I guess you can say I was brought up nominally Jewish. I mean, my parents were Jewish by birth, but we weren't exactly observant. In fact, I would probably consider us to be gastronomical Jews. And by that, I mean It was all about the bagels and lox and gefilte fish. And, if it was edible, then it was Jewish and had something maybe to do with God. But really, that was about it. I mean, we were culturally Jewish. We loved Woody Allen movies and all that. But, I would say we probably went to synagogue maybe once or twice a year. And it was all just seemed very remote and disconnected from my young mind. It didn't seem to relate, except for the food part. It didn't really relate to the important questions that even as an 8-year-old you're asking, about the meaning of life and all that. And and I would say, that I've always been spiritually curious, as I grew up and as I became a young adult. But that curiosity really didn't extend very far beyond books. I'm a great reader and really a great underliner of books. Joseph Campbell was once asked what his spiritual practice was, and he said, "I underline books."
Yeah.
And I'm with him on that, and I never met a good book that I didn't want to underline or circle a passage or doggy or something. And because it rings true, you recognize some truth that perhaps you had even been formulating in your own mind, but hadn't completely formulated. And you see it on the page and you're like, aha. But I can't say, with perhaps one or two exceptions, that I had anything resembling a spiritual experience. And, I live in Washington, D.C., and most of my friends are secular, I would say. And quite a few are atheists. Some are militantly atheist, even. They consider religion to be silly. Silly at best, dangerous at worst, I would say. As sort of a collection of superstitions that have nothing to do with their life today, that are sort of kind of an embarrassing leftover from a more primitive time. And I've never felt that way. And I can say I've never felt that any of these labels that we have to describe ourselves is really adequate. I would not consider myself an atheist because atheists are pretty much convinced and certain that God does not exist. And I'm not certain about anything. I'm not certain about what to have for breakfast, and I'm not a true believer either. And I'm not entirely comfortable, to be honest, with the term agnostic. I know that's sort of the default label that people give themselves if they're in between, but I find it a bit of a cop-out. Stephen Colbert once famously said that agnostics are atheists without balls. That's colorful language from him, as usual. But
as usual, yes.
I think there's something to that, and I think there's also sort of this passive quality to calling yourself an agnostic. Sort of, I don't know whether God exists, and I don't particularly care. Is this sort of unspoken message? I'm more of a, I would say, seeker, although the seeking is relatively recent. More curious and hopeful that there is, something more to life than meets the eye, however you want to define that.
So as you went through your work as a foreign correspondent with NPR, you've seen a great deal of the world, and you had an exposure to a wide variety of cultures, probably that most Westerners, particularly most Americans, don't get to see. Was your exposure to the spiritual side of those cultures somewhat limited? Did that ever have an impact on you prior to the event, which led to writing the book?
I mean, I would say, if anything, being a foreign correspondent made me less predisposed toward religion, not more. I think that has more to say about the job of the foreign correspondent than it does about religion, in the sense that, your job as a foreign correspondent is to focus on, let's be blunt about it, the worst of humanity, the least happy places, religion at its worst. I covered the aftermath of many suicide bombings and scandals involving the Catholic Church. Bad news is news. Good news is not news. So the fact that someone was quietly praying and finding solace and comfort and joy in that is not an NPR story necessarily. Probably not. So in living in Jerusalem, literally the city of peace, I did not find it very peaceful. In fact, I would say I felt even more alienated from my Jewish roots living in Jerusalem than I did anywhere else. Partly because of the animosity that's thick in the air there, these centuries of perceived hatreds and slights and wars. And, it's really a pretty tense place. And also, I was trying to do my job as a journalist, and if I were to become a sort of devout Jew, that might have gotten in the way. So, for whatever reason, um, no, I did not. I became, if anything, less religious in the traditional sense, being overseas. I mean, I had glimpses of very interesting things. I remember attending a Hindu festival called the Kumbh Mela on the banks of the River Ganges. It's I believe the largest religious festival of its in the world. Period. Some 18 million people showed up, and you know, the vast majority of them Hindu pilgrims, and then me with my microphone. That was quite something. Living in India for a time, I was open to the idea that not all religion had to be super dour and serious, and the colors were not always gray and black. They could be bright orange and blue and festive. So, that helped a bit. But overall, as I said, no, God was not rehabilitated in my mind while serving as a foreign correspondent.
Your first book, The Geography of Bliss, One Grump Search for the Happiest Places in the World. Let's talk about that for a minute. What was it that prompted you to write that, and what did you find most rewarding about it? What did you want to communicate with that book?
Well, it was, in a way, it was sort of the anti-journalism book, or anti-foreign correspondent book, in the sense, I mean that, um, as I said, being a foreign correspondent means basically going to the least happy places in the world. And once you get to these unhappy places, trying to find the least happy inhabitants of these unhappy places, whether it's victims of disease, famine, people who are really going through a tough time, and then you hang out with them for long periods of time, and you tell their stories, and that's very. I don't mean to belittle it. It's very important work, and I admire my colleagues who are continuing to do it. But if you're already predisposed to melancholy, as I am, and even bouts of clinical depression, I would say. It's really not good for you. It can be a real bummer, it can drag you down. And so I had this epiphany, one day that, what if I were to spend a year traveling the world seeking out the happiest places? And the second part of that epiphany was, what if I got NPR to pay for me to travel the world for
Even
3 months?
better.
Even better, but they didn't go for it because, as I said, that's not what journalists do. But I did find a book publisher who loved the idea, and that's what I did. It was actually a several-year-long project, sort of in traveling to the world's happiest places, but also traveling to places that might teach us lessons about happiness. And what I mean by that is, say, for instance, you believe that that money is the secret to happiness. Well, then Qatar in the Persian Gulf should be the happiest place in the world because it's the wealthiest on a per capita basis. But of course, I found that that is not the case. So I sort of treated the world as a laboratory of ideas, and which is what I continue to do, looking for ideas out there, wherever out there is, that may be a fresh take on age old and really universal problems.
Mhm. And you've done that with this next book as well. What is it that prompted you to go on this journey? There was a specific event that occurred.
There is. Well, shortly after I completed the manuscript for Geography of Bliss, um, I was relieved, but I also started to notice something was wrong with me physically. I had these really sharp shooting abdominal pains. I should preface all this by saying I don't like doctors. I don't like hospitals. My father was a doctor, specifically an oncologist, and I learned at a very young age that people died, and they tended to die in hospitals. And so my 8-year-old brain concluded that if I just avoided hospitals, I would never die. And so I did manage to avoid them until really this August day a few years ago when I had this sharp shooting pain. And my friend Michael eventually took me to the ER. And they did a bunch of tests and they found something, and I'm quoting here, funky on my CT scan. That's really not the combination of words um, you really want to hear. Funky and CT scan. Um, But I'm just lying there in this big paper towel. They call it a gown, but really it's a paper towel, and I'm scared. I am scared. And true, I tend to be a hypochondriac, but as I like to say, hypochondriacs get sick too. Um, and I thought this was it. Something was really wrong. And this nurse walks in, and she picks up on my fear, and she leans down and she whispers in my ear the following words: "Have you found your God yet? Have you found your God yet?" And that really freaked me up. That just totally amped up my fear, and I thought she'd seen my funky CT scan. I thought she knew something. She didn't say it maliciously at all. She said it in a very kind manner. I suspect she had one particular God in mind because this was Holy Cross Hospital.
Yes, I would suspect that is the case.
But she didn't say that, and I didn't take it that way. I took it as an open-ended question. Um, but she did phrase it that way. Have you found your God yet? Not have you found the God or God, period, but your God, as if, there was like one out there waiting for me. Almost like, on Match.com or something like that. Long story short, short story long, whatever. I spent 3 days in the hospital, and they did all kinds of tests, and all they can find that was wrong with me was a severe case of gas, intestinal gas brought on by stress. And um, it's a little embarrassing, but it's true. The good news is nothing was seriously wrong with me. I was discharged from the hospital, but there was that question: Have you found your God yet? And I decided to answer it. The only way I know how, which is mainly by getting on airplanes and going far away, but also reading a lot and sort of embarking on a really crash course in comparative religion, but one that I was determined to make not only intellectual but experiential as well, to experience these religions as much as possible, to try to get to their essence and to get personal, to not be a journalist about this and to keep my distance. I was going to dive in head first, knee deep, and if it was necessary, make a complete and cut and utter ass out of myself, which I did on a number of occasions. If you've read the book,
Which I imagine are the highlights of the book.
well, I'm also a fond believer in the uses of humor. I think basically humor can be used in two ways. One is to conceal the truth, and the other is to illuminate the truth. And I try for the latter as much as possible, although I realize I do slip into the former sometimes of, getting too close to an actual experience and resorting to humor to sort of to defuse the situation in a way.
Now, cafeteria spirituality is a common thing in our contemporary world. We are exposed to more than just what our forebears may have been exposed to just in their local area. That's it. And from that approach, you've sampled quite nicely from the dessert tray and gone on a journey to get a dose of each of these and see what they had to offer. I want to ask a few of the highlights of that journey. So I'm going to ask four different things. What was the most touching, the most crazy, the most frustrating, and the most rewarding? Let's start with the most touching. What touched you most in the journey?
Oh boy, that is tough. No easy questions here, huh?
Not well. I'll let you talk about
No,
yourself.
no.
That was the key.
Let's tackle this. There were a lot of things that touched me. I was touched. I'm just going to go off the top of my head here. I was touched when I was hanging with the Franciscans in the South Bronx in New York City. I spent a fair amount of time with them at the Friary, sleeping there at the homeless shelter attached to the Friary that they ran, and um, I confessed, so to speak, to one of the friars, Brother Crispin, who I quite liked. He was the sort of most psychologically attuned of the friars, I think, and I told him about my depression, that I have these bouts of depression that scare me. I really get down in a way that is more than just, I think, your everyday unhappiness. And he said, well, he listened carefully. We talked about it for a while. And then he said, would you like us to pray over you? To pray over you as they put it, not to pray for me or with me, but to pray over me. And I was intrigued by this. And I said yes, because I said yes to pretty much everything that came along in the course of researching this book. And we went to the chapel. And after the evening service, it was just myself and Brother Crispin and maybe two other friars. And I remember it was eerily quiet in there, except for the occasional passing airplane on its way to LaGuardia Airport. And they one of them put his hands on my forehead, and I'm kind of kneeling down in the pews, and they're invoking Jesus' name and asking for Jesus to intervene on my behalf. And I have to say, I have a high degree of skepticism about this sort of prayer. But what touched me was just that this was being done on my behalf. Um, and and there's this notion that Aldous Huxley talks about of human grace, as sort of one of the three kinds of grace that's out there, sort of animal grace, human grace, and divine grace, I believe. And this was human grace. This was three people who just wanted to help me, and they wanted to help so much that they were going to invoke the name of their God. And um, I was touched by that, and just the pure intention of what they were trying to do to help me. And you can say, well, oh, prayer is silly, or that did it really do any good? I felt their kindness, and I was touched by it. So that was, I would say, among the most touching. There were others.
Okay. How about the most crazy?
Oh, that's easy.
Tell me.
When I found myself shaving my legs and wearing a dress in Las Vegas. It doesn't get crazier than that,
A
really.
lot of people do that in Vegas, I hear.
Yeah, but not people who are on a religious quest. That's the key. Okay. So this was an investigation of the Raelians. The Raelians are very large in Quebec, in Canada, and they are the world's largest, in fact, the largest UFO-based religion. Have you heard of the Raelians?
I have heard of the Raelians.
You have. Are you
I
Canadian?
have, yes. I try to keep them at a distance, but I've heard of
I could tell you were Canadian. Yes.
them. Minnesotan, very close.
Yeah. No, but yeah, they believe that we were created not by God, but by a very advanced race of extraterrestrials called the Elohim. We were created some 25,000 years ago, and we were created for essentially one purpose: to have as much pleasure as possible. And so I found myself at a Raelian convention, a happiness academy, they called it, in Las Vegas, of course. And um, one of the exercises was a gender awareness exercise. We were supposed to get in touch with our feminine side. There is, of course, this idea in religious circles of what Jews call the Shekinah, or Hindus call Shakti, the sort of female power, the female side of us. And that was part of this exercise. And so I dove into this, and they gave us a bunch of clothes to try on, dresses and wigs, and I decided to become a blonde and attempted to shave my legs back in my room. And I don't know if you have shaved your legs on a regular basis or not, but it's
Not
really,
a regular basis.
no, it's difficult, and can be a bloody mess. And that was uncomfortable. The whole week there was pretty crazy. But I want to say the point was not just to be crazy, and not to make fun of the Raelians. That's too easy. But to actually get out there and see, what does a religion look like that is based on fun, a hedonistic religion. Because if you took a religion that said basically we should not have pleasure, we should not have sex, we would probably take it more seriously than the Raelians when they say basically we were created for pleasure. So it was a great opportunity to explore this connection between pleasure and religion, and why we reflexively assume that any serious religion frowns upon pleasure.
I seem to recall about the Raelians that they have a particular group, a female group that
The angels, yes,
the angels.
Rael,
That's right. They're celibate, except of course for the founder.
except for the Elohim and for Rael. That's true. Yes. And when I tell my female friends about this, they just get this look in their eye like, aha, like everything's clicking into place. And now they understand realism. And after that, nothing else I tell them about the Raelians sinks in. Um, you know, I mean, is Rael in it for the angels? I don't know. The Raelians seem awfully happy, and they get a lot of that human grace I talked about, from their religion. And at its basis, and it's any religion at its base has that element of human grace, or what Durkheim called collective effervescence. It's just we're hanging out with like-minded people, and often for a common purpose. And I know from my research into happiness that that will make you happier. The question is, because in these studies they found that people who are religious are consistently report being happier than people who are not, people who are secular. And why is that? Is it just this collective effervescence, this group bonding, or is there something else going on?
So what was the most frustrating thing that occurred?
That's got to be Buddhism, I would say, and attempting to meditate, and doing it with Wayne from Staten Island, in Kathmandu, and some of the apparent contradictions that would just spew out of Wayne's mouth. Wayne, what are the first steps? First steps are often last steps. Um, Wayne, I'm working on my practice. You need to drop the practice. Why should I drop the practice? You need to drop the practice to do the practice. What do you? And just we would go in circles. It seemed to me, and of course, as you're probably aware, meditating in itself is extremely frustrating. It's often it's presented as a relaxation technique, in a secular way in this country and around the world. And I think that's a bit disingenuous that, as you probably know, in Tibetan, the word for meditation is the root is to familiarize. You're familiarizing yourself with your mind. And eventually that may lead to relaxation, but at first it leads to a lot of frustration and monkey mindedness and all of that. So that was probably the most frustrating. That's not to say it wasn't ultimately rewarding, but sitting on that roof in Kathmandu with a gastronomical Jew turned Buddhist from Staten Island named Wayne, and going in circles with words. And Wayne objected to my use of words often. He would say, "You're using words," as if that were some sort of crime. And I see his point. Words can get in the way of a real experience, but I also think words can sometimes pull us along, propel us into having experiences. Otherwise, why would there be all these self-help books and all these spiritual books out there if people didn't find them somewhat helpful?
That can be very frustrating when you need guidance, just to start a particular practice, whatever kind it is, and to get koan-like circular references. I have found that to be singularly unhelpful, and it may be that way to engage with someone and help them in whatever their practice is beneficial once they have a grounding and some basic skills and are on a given trajectory, or that trajectory needs changing. But to start that way, I've never found that very helpful.
Yeah, no, and I can see that because it just seems like you're dealing with nonsense when you're told up is down and down is up, or that they're both the same. And I think there is wisdom in those koans and in those apparent contradictions, but it's only something that, I think you're right, comes later once it makes perfect sense to you, actually.
So, what was the most rewarding thing in your travels?
Toward the end of my journey, I went to Israel, not to Jerusalem, but to a town in the north called Tzfat. And to be honest, I thought I was going to just check off, the Judaism box and get back to those more interesting, you know, exotic Eastern religions, Buddhism, Taoism, and whatnot. But but I was pleasantly surprised by what I found, and more particularly by who I found in the town of Tzfat. This is a center of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic learning, and has been since the 16th century. And I met people there who were basically freelance Jews, for lack of a better word. They were sort of, in a way, refugees from both Orthodox Judaism, where they didn't fit in, and from completely secular Judaism, the gastronomical Judaism that I grew up with. And they found a Jewish way, a Jewish path that is very much of the heart. And that's what I always found lacking in Judaism, that it was all in the head. It was all about learning and memorizing sometimes and rules, do this and don't do this, especially don't do this. The Talmud has, the Torah has way more thou shalt nots than thou shalts. And that is just one view of Judaism. I found people there who were meditating, doing Jewish meditation, and I sort of joke that when I first encountered the term Jewish meditation, I assumed it was, a room full of middle-aged men and women sitting in the lotus position and silently contemplating the fact that their children will not amount to anything. But that is not Jewish meditation. It is, in fact, somewhat similar to Buddhist and Hindu meditations, in that you're sort of getting beyond thinking as we know it, and you're focusing often on letter combinations or sounds sometimes, mantras, but mantras that are in Hebrew. And I met people there like Yedida, who is a Kabbalist who would teach me every morning. And at the very end of my journey, I went to Jerusalem and I met with an old friend named Yossi Klein Halevi. And he's quite amazing. He's someone who doesn't go to synagogue, hardly goes at all, but is a very observant Jew, actually. And he welcomes the Sabbath in his own way. And he said to me something I won't forget, because I told him about my journey all around the world and everything except for the shaving my legs part. I didn't want to freak him out. And he said that religion is a language of intimacy with God, and you need to speak one fluently before you can learn another. So what he was saying basically is you need to be grounded in something. And he was hoping that something would be Judaism, but, not necessarily. So, you mentioned earlier what you call cafeteria religion or cafeteria spirituality, and we're doing it more and more in this country. And it is a good thing, but it is potentially dangerous if you're not getting enough nutrition if you're getting all desserts on your tray, for instance,
right.
And I do think that's important to be grounded in something. I think you can be ecumenical if you are grounded in one religion. Otherwise, there's the danger, and maybe you've met people like this who are just in perpetual dabbling mode. They sort of just try meditation for a while, but that gets too hard because it is hard. So they move on to maybe turning with the dervishes and the Sufi dervishes. That gets too hard. They move on to something else. And there is a danger of that. And I think that's what Yossi was trying to convey to me.
You mentioned earlier skepticism, and I think you've said in other interviews that you consider yourself a skeptic. And I'm wondering...
Skeptic, but not a cynic.
Skeptic, not a cynic. Excellent.
Right.
Thank you for bringing that up. Good. Head of the class. We have a chair for you in front. That's great. How do you relate that, being a skeptic, not a cynic, to maintaining an open mind, but not so far that your brains fall out? How do you strike that balance?
I think there's a fundamental problem here certainly with cynicism, but even with skepticism. And that is that, who was it? St. Augustine said, and I'm paraphrasing here, believe so that you should know. In other words, that belief can precede knowledge, but if you don't believe, then you don't know, and you never get to that knowledge. So, in other words, there's this swimming pool called God or enlightenment or whatever, but you're not going to go in the pool. And you've never experienced wetness or water, so you don't know what it's possibly like. And so you're standing outside the pool and you're not going to jump in. You've heard about people who've jumped in and drowned, and it just seems like a bad idea. So you wait for some sort of sign first of this wetness. Maybe the water, which you don't even know water exists, will come and splash on your body. But of course it won't. Most times you've got to dive in. So I think that in order to be on sort of worthwhile. I can't think of the right word. In order to reap the benefits of a spiritual search, you need to disarm skepticism, try something, jump in that pool or different pools, and then look around and say, am I wet? Does this feel good? Or am I drowning? Do I need to get out of here? But as long as you hesitate from taking that leap, whatever it is, you're always going to remain on the sidelines. So there are a lot of people who say, well, I'm skeptical about meditation, so that's why I don't try it. Or they try it, but their skeptical mind is so large, they're like, oh, this isn't working. This is silly. I'm sitting in this uncomfortable position, watching my breath. I could be watching Seinfeld reruns. This is such a waste of time. And yeah, I think that's a problem. The opposite problem, I think we're well aware of, is not enough skepticism, so that you believe everything you're told. But I'm a big fan of William James, a psychologist, philosopher from a century ago, who I think was a very wise man, and he once said that truth is what works. Truth is what works. And I really like that quote. And other people, when I tell them how much I like it, they're like, truth is what works. I mean, that sounds absurd. If I say 2 + 2 = 5, that's true for me. That works for me. No, that's ridiculous. But that's not what he was talking about. It's sort of like the placebo effect, it only works if you believe it's true. And so, we don't know why acupuncture works. We don't really know why, but it clearly does work.
Well,
so
actually, I'll stop there. We know it. We know something happens.
We know something happens, but if you're waiting, I think there's a difference between understanding how something works and whether it works. And I'm more interested in the whether it works. I don't think we need to understand exactly how something works. I'm looking at my computer screen right now. I don't know how it works, but I do know it works. Well, most of the time. Sometimes it crashes. So, yeah, that may be a long-winded answer to your question, but there you have it. Truth is what works.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much. For folks that are listening to the podcast, if you'd like to find out more about Eric and his work, his website is www.ericweinerbooks.com, and that's EricWeiner books.com. Eric, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.